The compound buzzed with whispers long after she walked away. The SEALs, who had once laughed at her, now spoke in low voices, their pride fractured, their certainty shaken. They gathered in corners and hallways, trading theories like soldiers passing. Contraband, some said she was former Black Ops, someone buried deep in the shadows of missions that had never reached the light. Others claimed she was never military at all, that she was something else entirely, something no one wanted to name aloud. Commander walked among them, his face carved with stone, his silence heavy. He heard their words. He felt their doubt. He saw the pride they clung to splintering beneath the weight of her performance. The record had stood for 10 years unbroken. Not, even by the best of them. Yet she had walked into their house without fanfare, without a uniform, and torn it apart with nothing but willpower. And now his men could not look at each other without the shadow of her echo between them. At the mess hall, one group argued fiercely. One man swore he had seen her before on a mission that was never spoken of, his voice sharp as he claimed she had been part of a classified team years ago. Another man laughed bitterly, saying if that was true, she would not have come here asking to try. She would have already known her worth. Yet the bitterness in his laugh betrayed the fear gnawing at his chest, the fear that she had shown them all their limits in front of each other. That night, the commander sat, alone in his quarters, the stopwatch still in his hand. He stared at the numbers glowing back at him, the proof of what she had done, the proof that no one could erase. He tried to tell himself it was coincidence that maybe she had trained harder than anyone suspected. But deep down, he knew better. Her movements were not the product of training alone. They were the product of experience, of battles unseen and scars invisible, and that truth weighed heavier than the silence in the room. The next morning, she returned, her body still bearing the marks of the gauntlet. But her eyes steady as ever, she walked into the compound without hesitation, as though she belonged there. The SEALs turned to watch her, their silence thick with resentment and awe, their discipline stretched thin between anger at being shown up and fascination at the mystery she carried. The commander stepped forward to meet her, his voice low and sharp, asking her why she had come back. She looked at him calmly and said, "I am not finished." Her words cut through the compound like a blade. The men stiffened their fists, clenched their jaws tight, because they had given everything to the grinder, and none had triumphed like her. Yet she claimed she was not finished, as though their record, their pride, their blood was only the beginning. The commander narrowed his eyes, demanding to know what she meant, but she offered nothing more, only the steady silence that left his men restless. Throughout the day, she lingered, at the edges of training, watching the men run drills, watching their bodies strain against the same trials she had conquered. The SEALs felt her gaze like fire on their backs. Some pushed harder, desperate to prove themselves. Others faltered there, minds haunted by the fact that she had already surpassed them. The commander saw it too, the effect she carried without a word, her presence alone bending the will of his unit. By evening, the tension finally broke. One of the veterans, a man hardened by years of missions, stepped forward to confront her, his voice sharp with fury, demanding she explain herself, demanding she tell them who she was, what gave her the right to walk among them and tear their pride to shreds. She met his anger with silence at first, and then she answered with words that froze every man within earshot. "I am no one you want to know." The veteran sneered at her words, calling them riddles, accusing her of hiding behind mystery, but as he stepped closer, she turned, her gaze on him, and for the briefest second, the steel in her eyes carried a shadow that made even him step back. He would never admit it, but he felt it. The weight of something older, darker, something that had seen death in ways he could not understand. The other men saw it too, and the whispers spread again like wildfire. Some said she was a ghost from missions buried so deep they were erased from history. Others said she was a survivor from a program that had been shut down because it had broken. Too many lives. Others said nothing at all because they did not dare name what they feared. The commander heard it all, and he knew the truth was dangerous because whatever she was, whatever her story, she was not done. And when she finally chose to reveal it, none of them would be ready. That night, as the compound settled into uneasy silence, the commander stood outside staring at the horizon. His mind heavy with questions, he wanted to believe she was only a visitor. Only a woman who had proved her strength, but the unease in his chest told him otherwise. He replayed her words again and again. I am not finished. And the more he thought of them, the colder his blood ran. Because he realized she had not come to prove herself to them. She had come to prove something to herself, and whatever that was, it carried shadows that reached beyond the record, beyond the grinder, beyond anything his men had ever faced, and he feared that soon those shadows would spill into their world, and as the wind tore across the training ground carrying whispers through the night, the commander knew that the real test had not yet begun. The dawn broke cold over the compound, the sea mist curling across the sand like smoke. The SEALs gathered in silence, their eyes drawn toward the woman who had changed everything. She stood at the edge of the training ground, her body still bruised from the grinder, her clothes worn from the trials, yet her posture was steady, her gaze unbroken. The commander stepped forward, his men forming a wall of silence behind him, because today the questions could no longer be left unspoken. He looked at her, the weight of his authority heavy in his voice, and demanded once more, "Who are you? What brought you here?" She did not answer immediately, her eyes drifting to the horizon as though searching for something unseen. The SEALs shifted their boots, grinding against the dirt, their patience fractured, their pride bleeding in the shadow of her victory. They needed answers, because without them the wound she had carved into their brotherhood would never close. Finally she spoke, her voice low, steady, carrying across the morning air. I came to see if I was still alive. The words struck them colder than steel. The SEALs exchanged glances, confusion and unease rippling through their ranks. The commander pressed harder. Alive, he demanded. Alive from what? But her eyes did not move from the horizon, her silence answering louder than words. One of the younger SEALs stepped forward, his frustration spilling over his voice, sharp as he accused her of mocking them, of hiding behind riddles. She turned her gaze on him, and for the first time her voice carried weight like thunder. I have seen things that should have ended me. I have done things that should have buried me, and I needed to know if I could still stand, if I could still fight, if I could still endure, and here I am. The men fell quiet, the sharpness of her words slicing through their anger, leaving only unease. The commander studied her face, the scars hidden beneath her calm, her eyes that carried storms deeper than battlefields. He knew then that she was no ordinary visitor, no outsider, no wanderer. She was something forged beyond their reach and her presence. Here was no accident. He asked her again, what mission, what war, what truth had driven her to this ground? She hesitated for a breath, then said, I was part of something that does not exist anymore. Something that was erased because it broke too many and spared too few. Her words hung in the air, heavy and raw. The SEALs shifted uncomfortably, their thoughts dark, because they all knew of programs whispered in shadows, missions that never reached reports, names erased from records they all knew, that somewhere beyond their sight, darker battles were fought by those who never came back. The commander clenched his fists, his mind racing, because if she was one of those erased, then her presence here was more than chance. It was a message, but from whom and for what purpose? He stepped closer, lowering his voice, asking her if she had come to challenge them, to shame them, to replace them. She shook her head once firmly and said, I came because I needed to know if I still belonged among the living. The words unsettled them deeper than victory ever could, because in her voice was a hollow ache, a truth of survival, not triumph. The men who had envied her now saw her differently. They saw not just a rival, but a ghost carrying scars, no flesh, could show, and in that ghost was a reflection of what they all feared becoming. But before the commander could press further, alarms broke across the compound, sharp and relentless, the sirens tearing through the morning silence the men snapped into. Motion instincts taking over, the commander grabbed his radio, demanding a report. The voice on the other end was strained, an unidentified vessel approaching the coastline, moving fast and silent. The SEALs scrambled into formation, their doubt replaced by duty. Yet as the commander gave orders, his eyes darted back to her, and what he saw froze his blood. She was already moving toward the shoreline, her steps swift and certain, as if she had been waiting for this moment, as if she had known it was. "Coming!" the commander shouted after her, demanding to know what she was doing, but she did not turn back. She reached the edge of the compound, the sea wind tearing across her frame. Her eyes locked on the horizon, where a dark shape cut through the mist, approaching closer. With every second, the SEALs rushed to follow, weapons raised, hearts pounding. Yet she stood calm, her body still, despite the chaos behind her. When the vessel broke the surface, its black hull gleaming against. The air grew heavier as she stepped toward the gauntlet, the final and most unforgiving stretch of the course. The SEALs shifted on their feet, some whispering wagers, some shaking their heads. The water hoses had already been rolled into place, streams of high pressure meant to batter the body and steal the last fragments of strength. The ground ahead was slick with mud, the air sharp with the sting of salt and force. This was where even the strongest stumbled. This was where the record had been, set and left untouched for 10 years. She stood at the threshold, her shoulders streaked with sand, her breath heavy, her eyes unblinking. She seemed small against the storm waiting ahead, yet there was something in her posture that silenced the last. Pockets of mockery, something that carried weight beyond the sight of flesh. The commander barked for the hoses to begin, and the water burst forward like roaring serpents, striking the mud, tearing into the course with merciless fury. The gauntlet was alive with chaos, and she was stepping into its jaws. Her first stride sank into the mud. Her body jolted sideways as the force of the hose slammed into her frame. The crowd of SEALs shouted, some cheering, some laughing, thinking this would be the end, but she dug her foot deeper and pushed forward, her body leaning against the torrent, her arms carving the air as she fought for balance. The mud clung to her legs with every step, dragging her down, pulling her backward, yet she moved again and again, as though she was driven by something stronger than the water or the weight of the ground. The hoses shifted their aim, pounding her shoulders, her chest, her face, her hair plastered against her skin, her vision blurred, but still she moved, each step a war against the elements. Each breath a victory clawed from the edge of collapse. The SEALs leaned closer. Now their voices tangled between disbelief and awe, because they could see the pain etched across her every muscle. They could see her stumble, they could see her falter, but they could not see her break. Halfway through the gauntlet, she dropped to her knees, the mud swallowing her in a gasp of silence. The crowd erupted, thinking the end had come, thinking the weight had finally claimed her. Yet instead of surrender, she clawed forward, her hands dragging her body through the filth, the hoses pounding harder against her back. She crawled inch by inch, her fingers gripping the earth, her knees tearing against the ground, every inch earned through sheer defiance. The commander felt his throat tighten, his chest grow heavy, because she was not moving like someone desperate. She was moving like someone possessed, someone who had carried battles unseen and now was unleashing them upon this ground. Her crawl turned to a stagger. Her stagger turned to a stride, and then she was back on her feet, her body trembling but her head high, pressing forward into the wall of water that seemed powerless to stop her anymore. The SEALs were no longer mocking, no longer laughing. Their voices were gone, replaced by a silence thick with something none dared admit, because each second she advanced stole from them the certainty of who they were. If she finished this, she would not only match the record, she would destroy it. She would leave a scar across the very foundation of what they believed, and none of them were prepared for that. Near the end of the gauntlet, the hoses angled downward, blasting into the mud to turn the final stretch into a swamp. Her legs sank deeper. Her strides slowed the roar of the water, swallowed everything. Yet her eyes never shifted from the line ahead, her hands clenched into fists, her teeth locked, and with a guttural force of will she lunged again, pulling, free of the sucking earth and pressing on. The crowd erupted into shouts now, not of mockery, but of instinctive disbelief. Some yelled for her to stop, others urged her forward, though they did not know why their voices carried desperation, as though they were caught in the tide of something greater than themselves, and she was the vessel breaking it open. Her body was battered, her skin raw, but the fire in her steps did not die. She stumbled again near the final 10 yards, collapsing into the muck, her arms shaking so violently that for a moment even the commander thought she could not rise. But then she pressed her palms into the mud and forced her body upward, one leg, then the other, her figure rising against the roar of water until she stood once more, the mud dripping from her face like shadow, her frame bent but unbroken, and then she ran. The last stretch was chaos, the hoses screaming, the mud clinging, the crowd shouting, but she did not falter. She sprinted through the storm, her arms slicing forward, her legs pounding against the earth, her body driven beyond the limits of human will, and as she crossed the final line, the whistle blared, cutting through the madness. The record shattered in an instant, the stopwatch clutched, in the commander's hand, glowing with numbers that no one had ever seen before. The crowd fell silent, the SEALs staring, their disbelief etched into their faces. Some dropping their eyes, unable to face what had just happened, others staring wide with awe because they knew what this meant. The 10-year record was broken not by one of their own, but by the stranger who had walked in with nothing but a question. The commander looked at the time again, his hand trembling. His breath shallow, he lifted his eyes to the woman who now stood at the end of the gauntlet, her chest rising and falling, her body broken, yet her eyes still steady, and in that moment he realized that this was no accident. This was no chance encounter, and the fear that gripped him was not of her strength, but of the reason behind it, because no one breaks a record like this without carrying a story far darker than the one told on the surface, and he knew that whatever had brought her here was only just beginning to reveal itself. Continue Part 4, 800 words without punctuation mark. The training ground was alive with the sound of waves crashing against the shore and the steady rhythm of boots striking the sand. The Navy SEALs moved in unison, their bodies carved from discipline and their eyes locked on the relentless drills. Before them, sweat poured down their faces, but they pressed forward with the kind of determination that only men forged in fire could carry. It was a morning like any other until she appeared at the edge of the course, watching silently as though drawn there by fate itself. The men noticed her immediately. Some smirked, others shook their heads. She did not belong here. Her stance, her frame, her calm eyes suggested she was only visiting a guest, perhaps curious about the kind of punishment these warriors endured every day. She wore no uniform, carried no weapon, and bore no sign that she had ever walked this ground before. To them, she was simply an onlooker, someone who would observe from a distance before returning to the world beyond their reach. Yet there was something about the way she studied the course that unsettled them, though none could put words to it. The commander barked orders, and the men launched into the next trial, a grueling sequence of climbs, crawls, and sprints across the harsh terrain, their muscles straining under the burden of endless repetition. The air grew thick with sand and sweat, and the men fought with every fiber to outlast the demands of the course. They were in the heart of the grinder, the place where weakness was torn away and only strength remained, and in the silence between their shouts and the crash of the surf, her voice cut through like a blade. "Can I give it a try?" she asked, and the words hung in the air like smoke. The SEALs froze mid-stride, their disbelief spilling into laughter. One or two shook their heads in amusement, others muttered under their breath, certain that she was joking because no outsider, no visitor, no one who had not trained for years could even hope to last a moment against the course that broke down even the strongest among them. Yet she stood calm, unflinching, as if her question was not a request, but a statement of intent. The commander raised an eyebrow, his voice sharp as he told her that this was not a place. For games, the course was brutal, designed to crush body and spirit alike. It was not something to be taken lightly. She did not flinch. She simply repeated the words softer, but with a fire that made even the veterans pause. "Can I give it a try?" The tone carried no arrogance, no bravado, only an unshakable certainty that unsettled them more than if she had shouted with defiance. The men exchanged glances. Some grinned, whispering that she would collapse before reaching the second obstacle. Others folded their arms, eager to see her fail. They were warriors forged by pain and steel, and they had seen countless men crumble under this same trial. How could she possibly hope to stand where so many had fallen? The course was not just physical, it was mental. It was a beast that chewed through pride and spit out defeat, and yet she stepped forward without hesitation, as if she had been waiting for this moment her whole life. The commander hesitated for a long breath, then finally nodded his approval, though his eyes carried doubt. He told her she could try, but warned that one step onto that sand meant commitment. There would be no stopping until the course ended, whether by victory or by collapse. She nodded once firmly, her gaze fixed on the path ahead, her feet carrying her onto the same ground that had broken even the hardest of men. The SEALs murmured among themselves, their laughter fading into silence as they watched her position herself at the starting line. The whistle cut, the air sharp and merciless, and she launched forward, her strides sure, her movements precise. She attacked the first wall with a strength that startled the onlookers, climbing swiftly and dropping down without hesitation, then hit the crawl through mud with a speed that defied expectation. The men leaned closer, their skepticism cracking into curiosity, their voices hushed as they followed her progress. She was not only moving through the course, she was moving with the confidence of someone who had done it before, yet none of them had ever seen her. The commander folded his arms, his expression tight because already she had lasted longer than he expected. Already she was proving that she did not step onto the course by chance. There was something in her every motion, something controlled, something dangerous. And as she tore through the first sequence without breaking pace, he felt the hairs on his neck rise. The course was designed to break spirits, not to bend so easily to a stranger. And yet here she was, turning their disbelief into silence. The seals who had been waiting for her to stumble now leaned forward. Their smirks gone, their laughter buried, because every second she endured stole a piece of their certainty she was not. Supposed to make it this far, she was not supposed to move with such precision. She was not supposed to belong here. Yet she did, and with every obstacle she conquered, she forced them to question everything they believed about what it meant to stand on that ground. And as she drove into the next phase of the course, her breath steady her movements, unbroken. The commander realized with a sinking weight that this was no mere visitor. This was someone who carried a secret, a reason for being here, that none of them yet understood, and the thought gnawed at him like a shadow creeping over the sand, because if she was not here to watch, then why was she here at all? The sun pressed harder against the training ground, its heat mixing with the sweat and grit that clung to the air. The seals gathered tighter around the course. Their arms folded, their eyes narrowed as the visitor drove herself deeper into the trial. Each step she took carved silence into their ranks, because every man present had seen countless hopefuls broken here, yet this woman was still moving strong, her muscles carrying her through obstacles that were designed to tear the fight from the toughest warriors. One of the men finally broke the silence, calling out to her, his voice laced with challenge, telling her that the real test was coming, that the walls ahead had ended careers and broken bones. His words were meant to rattle her, to shake the calm she carried, but she did not answer. She did not even look toward him. She only focused on the next obstacle, moving as though the taunt had never touched her ears. The seals exchanged glances, some grinning, others frowning, because indifference in the grinder was rare. Indifference usually meant a storm was hidden. Inside, she approached the rope climb, the towering structure looming against the burning sky. Even the veterans respected this task. It punished grip strength, it shredded arms, it dragged fire into the lungs, and it rarely let go without taking a piece. Of pride with it, she gripped the rope, leapt upward, and climbed without pause, her body weaving with practiced precision, and before any man could shout a warning, she had reached the top and swung down again as though gravity itself had bent to her will. The murmurs grew louder, disbelief spreading among them. One man muttered that maybe she had trained before, maybe she had hidden her background. Another countered that no civilian, no outsider could move like that. Not on her first run, not on a course that ate seasoned warriors alive. The commander remained silent, his gaze locked on her every movement, because each obstacle she passed made his suspicion grow heavier, and with it the sense that this was no accident. The next challenge loomed, the weighted carry across shifting sand barrels, stacked high, meant to pull the spine downward and force the body into collapse. Even the strongest of men staggered under its weight, the sand swallowing their steps like quicksand. Yet she bent low, hoisted the barrel, and moved forward. Steady and controlled, her eyes locked on the horizon. The barrel pressed into her shoulders like a living burden, and still she pressed onward, her pace unbroken. The seals shouted now, some with mockery, others with warning, telling her she could not last, that the sand would swallow her lungs whole, that the weight would crush her legs, that this was where her body would finally betray her. But she moved with a silence that unnerved them every step, calculated every breath drawn with purpose, her frame small against the endless weight, yet somehow unyielding, as though she was carrying more than iron, as though she was carrying memory itself. By the time she reached the end of the carry, her shoulders trembling with strain, her legs quivering, she did not collapse, as many expected. She lowered the barrel with deliberate control, then straightened, and without a pause advanced toward the next challenge, her steps slow but steady. The seals felt the air change their taunts, slipping into silence, their voices trailing off because none could deny what their eyes were seeing. She had endured obstacles that broke trained men, and she had not faltered. The commander finally barked at his men to continue, their own drills unwilling to let them stand idle, but his own eyes never left her. He studied her movements, each stride, each reach, each breath, because somewhere in her rhythm he heard the whisper of experience. This was not the work of a beginner. This was the work of someone who had been tested before, somewhere unseen, somewhere unspoken, and the thought pressed cold into his chest. She reached the endurance crawl. The sand pit stretched long and merciless beneath the netting barbed wire low. Enough to tear flesh if one lifted their head too high. The crawl devoured lungs, scraped knees, shredded resolve. The SEALs who trained here knew its cruelty well, and they watched with morbid fascination as she dropped to the ground and drove herself forward. Every pull of her arms digging through sand, every push of her legs sliding her closer to the end. The wire snagged at her hair. The sand clawed at her face. Yet she did not slow. Her breath came, H.